So you can hear from that little message that this meeting is being recorded. Hello to everyone. My name is Brenda Drum. I am Head of Communications with MIA and just want to thank you all for joining us from across the Mercy world. You heard the little message there, not in my voice, saying that the meeting has been recorded, just to make you aware of that. We're delighted to gather again in this online space to explore the rich heritage, spirituality and ongoing legacy of Catherine McAuley and the Mercy tradition. And these webinars are being offered as part of our pathway, our path to the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the first House of Mercy, which we'll celebrate next year on the 24th of September, but in lots of other ways between now and then. And they're an opportunity to deepen our understanding, strengthen our connections, and reflect together on how the Mercy story continues to inspire and challenge us today. We're delighted that we have our Head of Heritage and Spirituality, Caroline Thompson, with us, and she will take over shortly. She'll guide us through the session and facilitate any discussion. So whether you're joining us for the first time or whether you've been with us on a couple of our other webinars and heritage, you're very, very welcome. So a few little notes before we start, just a few little Zoom courtesies. Just please keep your audio on mute unless we get to a section where we're inviting everyone to come in and chat. Use the chat function for any technical issues, any questions, and if you've anything that you need to talk to me about urgently, you can direct message me or send an email to info@mercyinternational.ie. Caroline will be in the zone and will not be able to keep an eye on the chat, so I'm going to look after that for her today. The recording of today's webinar will be available through a link in the June issue of Mercy e-News, which will be published shortly. And this gives me an opportunity to do a little sell. If you're not already subscribed to Mercy e-News, go onto our homepage, mercyworld.org, and there's a button at the very bottom, and click there. You'll get notification of all future webinars, events, and all Caroline's lovely heritage content and Heritage Corner in Mercy e-News. If time permits, we'll bring in as many questions and comments as we can. So we hope you enjoyed the webinar today. I'm going to hand over to Caroline now. Caroline, the Zoom stage is very much yours.
Thank you, Brenda, and hello everyone. Welcome to the second of our Heritage series, and it's lovely to be with you. I can't see any of you. I can only see the slides, but when the presentation's finished, I'll be able to see your faces and see who's with us today. This particular presentation picks up from the last, which was on the penal laws. And I just want to start by saying that the poverty that was inflicted on Ireland through the penal laws was extraordinary. It was brutal, it was unrelenting, and it was dealt with in a bitsy-piecey sort of way that did not particularly help the people of Ireland for many, many years. And I wanted to base this presentation on Catherine's well-known saying, "The poor need help today, not next week." And the reason for that is the poverty existed. It was how Catherine dealt with that poverty that made a difference, and we'll have a look at that as we go through. So just as I suppose a link to the last session that we did, just want to have a quick look at the impact of the penal laws. You remember the penal laws came in toward the end of the 1600s. They were pretty much gone by Catherine's birth time, which was the late 1700s. But the 1800s, which is when, of course, the House of Mercy opened in 1827, is when the real impact of what they had done, the British had done, started to, well, became really evident in Dublin and across Ireland. We do know that Dublin was a place of extraordinary wealth and dreadfully squalid living conditions. It was described at one stage as the jewel of the British Empire, as far as the Georgian architecture, the width of the streets, the beauty of a lot of the public buildings. But behind that facade was an increasingly degrading and squalid story. We know there was no social infrastructure for the for dealing with poverty. We know that there was terrible overcrowding and filthy streets. Mind you, I walked in Dublin today and the streets were still pretty dirty. But anyway, I think the worst filth. We know that a lot of the river was polluted, as with the canal. We know that there were regular outbreaks of diseases, typhus and TB and smallpox and cholera, all of which are caused by dirty water and damp living conditions. We know that the chances of a baby surviving were very, 1 in 3, I think, was quoted, that there was violence and excessive punishment. There was the obvious corollary, which was petty crime and vagrancy. The prisons were full and alcohol was abused. And domestic violence and the sexual abuse of children were also huge problems in those sorts of places where lots of people were living together. And one of the things that Catherine particularly picked up on was the widespread ignorance, the lack of schooling, the lack of education. Well, not just the lack of, the banning of any education for Catholic children. So there was a widespread despair and loss of hope, which you can imagine if you were living at that time. So we also know that the Irish economy had collapsed. The English took over the farmland. 4/5 of the farmland of Ireland had been taken over by the 1820s. And so they had destroyed the foundations of Irish trade, and all those people who were displaced from the land flocked to the city. Mass unemployment. Many of the crops grown on those farms were exported to England, so there were food shortages in Ireland, and the prices of basic produce was enormous. So if you wanted to buy potatoes in Dublin, after you'd lost your plot, in the country where you grew your own, that took up most of your wage. We're seeing a little bit of that now at the moment with, price increases on basic goods, but it was quite dire. We know that when the Parliament moved to England, the departure of the wealthy families took further jobs away from the cities, particularly Dublin. Women who were employed as domestics and household staff lost their jobs. The Industrial Revolution had not reached Ireland in a big way, so there were very few factory jobs at that time. And families evicted from the farms had very few choices, but to head to the cities and the larger towns and join thousands of others struggling to survive. This image is meant to be an image of people coming from the country outside of one of the poorhouses, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that's the sort of economic and social structure that we're dealing with, and that Catherine McAuley was born into. She was born in 1788. She opened a House of Mercy in 1827. By 1827, these issues of dire poverty had come to an absolute head. In the 1841 census, now 1841 we know is the year Catherine died, but I thought it was an interesting snapshot of the country. 37% of men and 18% of women were, that should be literate. Only that number were literate. Ireland had a population of 8 million, and 80% of them had been living on the land. 40% of the housing was categorized as fourth class, that's the lowest class, and that meant either no windows, no floors, or single room dwellings for families. So in Dublin, in 1841, 23,000 families were living in fourth class housing. Domestic servants, if they could get work, were poorly paid. And a guy called Cullen, a historian, described the people. He said, if you're in the streets of Dublin, very few people had coats. Women and children had no shoes. And women with children and single women were the most vulnerable. Women outnumbered men amongst the destitute. So that was his description of the situation. And I remember when we visited Carlo, Sheila Curran was saying that in some places families shared clothes. They had one set of good clothes among, say, 4 or 5 families. And so if you had to go, say, to Mass or to a baptism, then the clothes were shared. 70%, 5% of the families in the west of Ireland lived in extremely poor conditions. So it wasn't just Dublin, it was a whole island problem. And Whitelaw said this, he said, I've been frequently surprised that from 10 to 16 people, all of ages and sexes, in a room, not 15 feet square, stretched on a wad of filthy straw, swarming with vermin, and without any covering save the rags that constituted their clothes. He said they found between 30 and 560 people living in a single 4-story Georgian house. So every room became a room that housed a family. Sometimes the families were up to 10 or 15 people. This was the reality that we're talking about. This is the poverty of Catherine's world. So I think the first thing to say is that the poverty was grinding, soul-destroying. And the second thing was that it was sanctioned by 2 things: bureaucratic inaction and deeply held attitudes towards poverty and the people who experienced it. You know, the idea that there's a deserving and an undeserving poor, that poor people were poor because they were lazy, unmotivated, drunkards, you know, that it was their fault they were poor. And this is the thing that Catherine railed against, that poverty was something that was your own fault. The poor were treated like criminals, and help was often slow, deliberate, and conditional. So one of the things they wrote was that poor were morally unsavory, dishonest, ungrateful, and dangerous. I read a shocking report the other day about the man who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the government in England. He was writing about the loss of nearly 3 million people, either to emigration or death, in the famine, which was 1845, so about 5 years after these studies, that it was a good thing because it got rid of a level of society that were morally unsavory. That's the attitude. That's the attitude of educated people to poverty. So when we talk about Catherine McAuley's passion for the poor, it was about a really profound belief that was not shared widely, that all people, the face of Christ is present in all people, in the sick and the poor and the homeless and the uneducated, the dying and the despairing. There wasn't, well, that guy is a drunk or that woman's a prostitute, therefore they're not worthy of our help. All people were the presence of Christ. And that was the difference in how her response to poverty, not just for her, there would have been other groups who would have had the same ideas. The Quakers in particular were very, very proactive in dealing with the poverty. Some of the other religious orders that were operating at the same time as Catherine, the Presentation Sisters in Dublin, the Christian Brothers in Dublin, the Loreto Sisters, came from the same idea. But the bureaucrats, those people who were in control of the response to poverty, they believed these people deserved what they got. And we call it today, you call it today exclusionary design, bureaucratic gatekeeping, hostile architecture. Those things are still present in our society today. So when you're walking around and you see benches on train stations that are vertical, not horizontal, they're built so homeless people can't sleep on them. That's hostile architecture or exclusionary design. Things that you put in place, making people wait 3, 4, 5 weeks for Social Security benefits. That's bureaucratic gatekeeping. without any thought of how they're going to live for that 3, 4, or 5 weeks. Living in a society where the cost of housing is so great that people can't afford it, they live in a tent in a park and then coming in and taking that away. Those are the sort of attitudes to poverty that existed in Ireland that we still see today. So those 3 little girls, aren't they beautiful? Probably in their Sunday best, I'm not sure, but that's a genuine photo from the time. So this was the reality. So when Catherine said, the poor need help today, not next week, she was railing against the attitude to how the poor received help. Now, the first thing that the British did, they came under enormous pressure from the rest of Europe to do something about the poverty in Ireland. People were coming back from Ireland and writing in newspapers and petitioning the government to say, you cannot allow this to continue. So the British response to that was to set up poorhouses. That's the Irish name for it. I won't try and pronounce that. My Irish is not very good. But in 1838, they brought in the Poor Law Act to do something about this. Now, remember, the House of Mercy, 1827. So Catherine had been working in this area for 10 years before the government stepped in and said, oh, well, we'll do something about the poor. They were very bleak and very brutal places. They were designed to punish rather than welcome, to deter people from seeking help. You know, if you go into a poorhouse, the first thing they would do is they would separate you from your children. So the children were sent to one part, the mother to another. Men and women were not allowed to be together. So families were broken up for a start. You had to, the food was pretty basic. The requirements to actually come in were fairly strict. The cleanliness was not good. In the 1840s, between 1838 and 1845, which was when the famine happened, 130 of these places were built in Ireland. So that was the bureaucratic response to the poverty that we talked about. Get them into these places, make it as nasty as you can, so they're not encouraged to stay, split them up, don't give them any comforts. And the interesting thing is that these places were funded by taxes on Catholics who had property. So if you were a Catholic and you had a farm, your taxes were paying for these brutal places to exist. Not, I will add, by any money coming from the British government. In contrast, we know Catherine focused on education, not punishment, shelter offered with kindness and compassion, not any sort of further brutalization. She encouraged home visitation so people didn't have to come out of their homes rather than institutionalization. And she focused on giving women and girls skills. Remember, I said that the women and girls were the highest group represented in the destitute in Dublin at this time. So it's a very different response. The poor need help today, not next week. If you knocked on the door of the House of Mercy, it was opened immediately. And there were no conditions like, we have to put this request to a committee and we'll let you know next week whether you can come in. If you knocked on the door of the House of Mercy to receive a meal, the meals were there, ready for you. That was her philosophy. There's a couple of other groups I just wanted to talk about while we're talking about poverty. We know that Catherine had a very interesting relationship with the prostitutes who plied their trade, particularly along the canal once it was opened there. In 1838, there were 402 brothels in Dublin. and 200,489 arrests in that particular year. Most of those women were sent to the Lock Hospital. The Lock Hospital was basically, as it's mentioned, a place, again, where they were further brutalised, or if they were considered to be second or third or fourth offenders, they were incarcerated in the worst cells in the jail. And again, subject to sexual abuse by the jail guards. So prostitution was in many ways the last, well, probably for a lot of women, the first resort to actually make enough money to feed their families, but very, very, very dangerous if you were caught. There was no protection for prostitutes against bashing or assault or anything like that. There were no rape laws in place in Dublin at that time. So Catherine was said to have known the name of all of the prostitutes who were working around the Baggot Street area and would often bring them in, give them food and clean them up, if they had been beaten. So I just want to talk about that's prostitution as a particular form of employment for women, but which was very, very brutally dealt with by the powers that be. And then we have public begging. In 1772, they brought in the Mendacity Act, and that was where they had these rules that you were either a deserving poor person or an undeserving poor person. And you often had to wear a badge. So the helpless poor, those who couldn't help it, like the elderly, were often badged and authorised to beg. But other people, like disorderly persons or people who'd just come in from the country or deserted women, they were arrested and sentenced to jail for hard labour. So that was the treatment of beggars on the street. And at certain times in Dublin's history, there were beggars everywhere, often children, just making enough money to feed the family that night or to be able to afford the very, very expensive food that was on offer. So when we look at Catherine McAuley, and this is a Claire Agnew sketch of Baggot Street, where the sisters provided food, a soup kitchen at night. Her program of welcome everyone, provide food, provide comfort, provide clothing sometimes when it was needed, was a real countercultural statement against the barriers of indifference and discrimination that were out there in the wider Dublin community. So she established a ministry of social care and compassion, not a bureaucratic response to a problem involving people who were considered to be architects of their own problems. And at one stage, Catherine also said this: it's better to relieve 100 imposters than to suffer one really distressed person to be sent away empty. Because people would say to her, Catherine, some of these people aren't poor. Some of these people are just, coming to get a meal from you. She doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. If one person who really needs help is sent away, then the whole thing is not worth it. So again, the attitude toward the poor was that they were all out to con you, to fool you, to rob you, not that they were poor because the social, political, economic conditions forced that particular thing on them. And you've all heard the story of the girl from Killarney. The girl from Killarney was a young girl who'd run away from home. She headed to Dublin. When she got to Dublin, it was dark. She was scared. She found out where the convents were, and she knocked on the door of 2 convents. Both of them, the door wasn't open. The little window was open, and she was told, no, we're not taking anyone in. Come back in daylight hours. In the first one, and the second one, no, we're not taking anyone at the moment. You have to apply to this particular committee. She was told to go to Miss McAuley's house, where the door was opened Secondly, she wasn't treated with suspicion. She was given a chair and food. Someone listened to her story, and the sisters wrote immediately to her father to tell him that she was safe, and he came back to get her. It was one of those evil stepmother type stories, but that was the difference. And it's a beautiful story because it tells us that that was the difference. When Catherine was at Coolock, she was upset that there was nowhere for girls who were at risk to go. And she wanted Bagot Street to never turn anyone away. So I love that story of the girl from Killarney. I think it really sums up Catherine's philosophy towards the poverty of her time.
Caroline, I have a question that's come in just to
Sure.
me on direct message here before you move off that slide. Who was opening the door? Who would have been the first person that this girl from Killarney would have met?
Well,
Who
often in
at the
those
door?
convents, they had someone who was the door opener. Believe it or not, it was actually a ministry within the convent. So we know that in most convents they had horariums where they had what happened during the day, but they would be sisters would be appointed to different things. Some sisters might have been down cooking in the soup kitchen. Some sisters might have been in the infirmary looking after the sick sisters, and there was always a sister who was the door opener. So it would have been whoever was on roster for the door opening, but they would all have been told, you don't turn people away. You welcome people in. And that was a big difference because most of the other convents, I'm not saying which convents, but some of the other convents, they closed at night for, perfectly reasonable safety reasons, or they wouldn't have had space for people. It's said the same is said of the hospitals, that the hospital porters closed the doors at night and wouldn't let people in. And often when they came in the morning to open the doors, there would be either a whole lot of sick people or some dead people waiting on the pavement. But the Mercy Hospital kept its doors open always. There was a porter there and the doors would be open. If you needed help, the poor need help today, not next week. So, yeah, I would say it would have been whatever sister was on roster. Or if they had a door sister, that was a system in some convents, there would have been the door sister. I think they were called a door sister. Is that helpful, Brenda?
Thank you. Yes, I'm getting the thumbs up here.
Okay. So just thinking now generally, Catherine's response to the poverty was powerful because she knew what was going on in the richer part of Dublin because she had been part of that. She had grown up in that. But she also knew what was happening in the poorer parts of Dublin because her sisters were walking out every day. They were going to the poor. They were in the back alleys where the families were living. And what she saw was that poverty had faces. And those faces were faces of men and women and children. Whereas the bureaucratic response, poverty was just numbers or beds in a workhouse. She saw that poverty had a face. And I think that's a beautiful statement by Dermot Martin there about Catherine McAuley, because that's, I think, her approach. And so what distinguished her from others, and there were, I said before, there were many other people who were trying to help the poverty around them. Many. There were, as I said, the Quakers. They were renowned for their social outreach. And Catherine, having spent 20 years nearly at Coolock House with Mrs. Callaghan, who was a Quaker, would have, I think, in some ways imbibed some of that spirit as well. The Presentation Sisters were at work on the other side of the river. The Christian Brothers were educating the poorer boys and visiting the prisons and all those sorts of things. They saw that poverty was not just about handouts. It was about changing society so that those people who were at the bottom could get a sense of belonging. That was the whole purpose of setting up. The very first thing she did was set up a school and start giving the girls and the women skills so they could raise themselves out of it. It's that whole idea of, if you want to feed a person, don't give them a fish, give them a rod so they can fish for themselves. That was her approach to the poverty of her day. And that made her different. Obviously, because of the gospel, because of her beliefs that, what Jesus was asking was, go out through the corporal and spiritual works of mercy and feed the hungry, visit the sick, sit with the dying. So that's the end, 20, 30 minutes of presentation. So over to some questions now.
I have a couple of comments for you, Caroline. Mary Lyons tells us that the portress was the title given to the person who answered the door, and that person was usually a lay sister. It's a great name.
That's right, the portress.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, sometimes they were lay sisters. Catherine didn't have she had lay helpers, but she didn't necessarily go in for that system of lay sisters. That came in a bit later in the mercy world. But yes, the portress. That's right. I remember that now.
Yeah. I don't have any questions as yet. I'm going around just unmuting a few people. So if you do have a question, if you want to wave your hand, if you want to come on, or a comment, or I did pick up a comment up above. Just bear with me a second. Someone just commenting on the attitude to the poor, which is sort of resurfacing today.
Yes.
That attitude to the poor that you spoke about. Someone just made a comment on that.
Yeah, very much. And I think that's the worry with bureaucracies, when you have people who don't see, like Catherine said, the face of the poor, the face of Christ in the poor, but to see a problem, and it's their problem. They're poor because, they've made silly decisions. I mean, all of those things, I see them all the time, and it's sad, really, because it shows we haven't really gone very far as human beings in our treatment of people. And I always like to say made poor, because you're not born poor necessarily, you're made poor by the circumstances of the place in which you live. And certainly the people of Ireland were plunged into poverty very much because of circumstances way outside their control. Way outside their control. So it was a sad thing, but when you look at every person that was helped by Catherine McAuley, every woman who went out of the House of Mercy with a skill, whether it was lace making or domestic service or whatever, that was one rung out of that poverty. And we look at Ireland today, and it still has poverty, but it certainly raised itself out of poverty through the work of people like Catherine and education in particular.
I had a comment from Suzanne, who just in response to the first part of she's here.
I can see her.
There you are, Suzanne. Do you want to articulate it yourself rather than me speaking for you?
All right. Well, it's just the level of, I really it didn't impact on me as much before of how institutionalized the poverty in Ireland was. How much it was decided from London, and how the Irish were just put to one side. But you also made a remark, Caroline, at the beginning about seeing rubbish on the streets this morning. And another thing that came to me was the number of issues that you mentioned that are contemporary issues. I was particularly taken by the domestic violence and sexual abuse. Like they are maybe perennials, I don't know.
And I think I suppose the overcrowding, like I went to there's houses in Dublin, and they have the history on the outside that this house had 169 people living in it, at one stage, that when you put a lot of people and alcohol and women who probably can't watch their kids at every time of the day, you're going to have predators, you're going to have those circumstances where kids can be taken advantage of, and no laws against sexual violence. And nowhere for women to go, even if they wanted to get away from those situations. Where could they go? the poorhouse would have been just as bad. And they knew when they walked in the doors of that poorhouse, their kids were taken. Their kids were somewhere else. They didn't have their children with them. So, it was a pretty hard life.
Yeah, you used the word cruel in a couple of those slides. And that's
Which one?
a hard word, cruel,
Cruel. It was
C-R-U-E-L.
cruel. Yeah, it was cruel
That was
rules.
in the whole system,
And it was
that there was cruelty.
deliberately cruel. They could have been kinder, but they chose to be cruel.
Yeah.
And that's what I was thinking about. Like before I left Australia, they were rounding up people who were living, like in Australia, you can live in a tent in the park. It's not that cold in some parts of Australia. Because of the homeless, the cost of housing, there's a huge homelessness problem. But instead of going and trying to relocate those people, they came in with a bulldozer and just knocked everything down, destroyed all their stuff, the little bit of stuff that they had, the tent, maybe the cup and the saucer, whatever. That's cruel. It might be legal, but
Caroline,
it's
that
cruel.
happened on the canal just down from Bagot Street a couple of times last year as well. So it is still something that's happening in the contemporary world.
And you can't tell me people choose to live in a park, in a tiny tent. So often they're forced that way. Often they may have made stupid decisions, but often they cannot afford to get a house or they can't find a house. And that's the response of a bureaucracy. So, well, the law is they can't sleep in the park, so we'll just go in and we'll drive a tractor or a mover right through their stuff. I think that's cruel.
Any other questions or comments for Caroline?
Hello to everyone from Australia. I didn't mean to pick on Australia today. That's
Well, just to tell you the countries, Caroline, we've Newfoundland, we've regions: Sydney, Maine, USA, Tuam, County Galway, Melbourne, Brisbane, New Zealand, London, where they're expecting a thunderstorm this afternoon, Chicago, Oklahoma, Buenos Aires, Limerick, and so a nice, and Dublin and Kildare as well, just to add ourselves. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Sylvia just made a comment there. Amazing how the exact same situations are still the norm in many places around the world, South America among them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the work of Catherine McAuley really goes on. And I suppose that the challenge to us is, what's our attitude to poverty? It's in all of our societies. I've got a unit looking out over a public footpath, and there are people sleeping down there every night. What's our attitude to that? And if we have an attitude of, well, what are they doing there? Or that's a bit scary, or I don't like those people being there. Well, what option do they have? Like we need to question, we need to interrogate our own approach, which is where Catherine was coming from, and then how the bureaucracy that we live in is actually dealing with that. And, write letters, talk to people. Protest, I think, but I don't want to cause social uprising here. But I think the important thing for me when I put the topic, what poverty in Catherine's time was not the poverty, was her response to it, and her attitude that the poor are loved by God, they are faces of Christ in their own self, and therefore should be treated with respect. And I think that's a beautiful philosophy for us to take forward.
There's a comment here from Barbara Jeffrey. The project Women at the Well, run in King's Cross, will be celebrating their 20th anniversary next year, and they look after women who are caught in prostitution in the present day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the oldest profession, isn't that what they say? I mean, Jesus was dealing with prostitutes as well. I mean, that it's it's sad, but I think prostitution in Catherine's day must have been a dreadfully dangerous and dire thing. And where were their children? while they were out trying to get enough money together to feed them. And what happened if they were dragged off to prison? All those questions, they all have sort of social repercussions. So, yeah. And prostitution doesn't exist without a market. A lot of those men who are making those rules and enforcing those rules were also taking advantage of the women as well. So we bear that in mind. But yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Well, it's lovely to see you all. I see some people I know there as I was heading down. Anne Hetherington, I saw you.
Yeah. Caroline, do you want to talk a little bit about your next webinar? And we'll bring this, I think, to a conclusion. And just to remind people that the recording will be available through Mercy e-News.
It's
over
July
to you, Caroline.
July the 22nd, isn't it? From memory. I had it at the end of that slide. Yes, July the 22nd, which is a Wednesday, same time, same channel. And I'm looking at Coolock as a specific, I see it as an incubator for what Catherine did in Dublin through her time spent in Coolock. So I thought I might have a quick look at Coolock because she went from Coolock to Bagot Street. And if you visit Bagot Street, you can actually go in the Callahan room where there's lots of things that have come from Coolock. So we have that sort of connection there. So I'm going to have a look at Coolock next time. So if you're interested in Coolock or you want to pick it up later on on a delayed webinar, you're very, very welcome. But it's great to see you all. It's been lovely.
So Caroline, just on behalf of everybody to thank you. There's some nice comments coming in for you there in the chat. Some of you, I think, are already registered for the one in July, but the registration link for Heritage Webinar 3 will also be in Mercy e-News. So just to thank all of you for coming, for your attention, and we will see you on the next one.
Yep. And read Mercy e-News. There's a great article in there about the rose, the Catherine McAuley rose. Bye, everyone.